Now I want to talk about some of the problems I have with the way the war was fought. Now, I don't want to approach this from a strategic military angle. I'm not a tactician. I'm not a strategist beyond just every other armchair person who ever watched a World War II movie. But what I will say is that there were a couple of huge errors that the Allies made that made the war a lot worse than it had to be. And the first one, I think the most obvious, is the decision to demand, way back in 1941 or 42, the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. Now, this is a really bad idea. When you're fighting somebody, it makes a lot of sense to give them an out, to give them a reason to maybe want to surrender. It never makes sense to just say, you should, your choice is to fight us to the death, or, then you're asking to fight them to the death, and it'd be better if they could give up. And by placing this before them, you put yourself in a position where the government at least has to fight to the end. Now, people have this idea that, no, you're being soft if you say this. There's nothing soft about it. If you don't ask for unconditional surrender and the Nazis offer terms that are unacceptable, you just say, these terms aren't acceptable, we're going to keep fighting. If you think of something better, go ahead. And it should be noted, Goebbels was explicit that the fact that unconditional surrender was demanded was some of the best propaganda that they ever had, because they could easily go to the soldiers and the generals and say, look, with unconditional surrender, they can do whatever they want to Germany. They can divide it up, which actually is what happened. They could execute everybody. They could enslave everybody. There's no way to come to any kind of terms at all. And so the only recourse we have is to fight and hope that we win, even if the odds are totally against us. Like I cited earlier, the book by Manstein, he says it right there. A lot of people said, hey, we are in impossible odds, but it doesn't matter, because think about it. If someone came to you and said, I'm going to kill you, you have no reason to resist. You have no reason not to resist them, even if you don't have much hope of winning. It's kind of well known that there are many attempts at Hitler's life. The fact that there was this ultimatum that there be unconditional surrender actually hurt that. If the Allies had come out and said, we understand you German people are proud people, and it's not all your fault, it's all the evil Nazis' fault. If you just get rid of the Nazis, we can end this war. I highly doubt that they could have lasted a few months. Speculation, I know. But Hitler was lucky not to be killed as it was. Had the Allies been shrewd enough and wise enough to have said something to that effect, the impetus to kill him or get him out of power would have been many, many times what it was. And many people in the military could have done it without thinking that... because the people who attempted to do it, Treschow and Stauffenberg and all them, and that's just the one plot, there are many others, they were taking a big risk, because they could execute Hitler and still suffer a merciless peace by the Allies. It just so happened that Hitler was so bad that they figured it was worth the risk. But if they had been offered terms, it would have been better. And the other big issue I have with the war is that so much was given to the Soviets, and I don't know why. Because when Churchill was begging Roosevelt for any help he could get, Roosevelt drove a very hard bargain with Churchill. He demanded that they cede colonies to us, they give bases to us. He demanded free trade with the Dominion. It was one of the big things. The whole economy of Britain was predicated on having free trade status with its Dominion, with its colonies, and excluding everybody else. And Americans had actually been trying to get into this for a long time. And Roosevelt made them do it. He said, yeah, you want our help. Okay, well, we want free trade with Australia and India and South Africa and Kenya and Australia, and he got it. Now, when Stalin asked for things, and he was in a much, much lower bargaining position than Churchill was, he got all that stuff for free. He got everything that he demanded on a silver platter, and I don't understand why. I mean, it's famous that Roosevelt called him Uncle Joe. It'd be like calling someone Uncle Adolf or Uncle Dracula. He's worse than all of them, or maybe they didn't know at the time. Now, to his credit, Churchill, I believe, at some level understood the evil of the Soviet Union, and I think he considered maybe fighting the war in a way that would mitigate, to an extent, the damage the Soviet Union would do. This is the whole, the idea behind the invasion of Italy. The Allies invaded Italy. That was Churchill's, something that he was really pushing for. Stalin kept saying he wanted a second front. He didn't like that the Soviet Union was exhausting itself in the war with Great Britain. You could say that he just didn't think it was fair that they were bearing the brunt. And who knows in fair it's war, but I think the real reason was he didn't want the Soviet Union to be any weaker at the end of the war than it could be. And he was always saying he wants a second front, but he was explicit. He wanted it in Western Europe. He wanted it in France, or maybe an invasion of Spain or Norway or something. He didn't want them. He didn't want the English and the Americans to get between him and the areas he wanted to control after the war. And it looks like Churchill actually did want to do that. That was part of the reason that Italy was invaded. And there was a big debate in 1943 where Churchill wanted the next landings not to be in Normandy, but to be in the Balkans, either in Greece or in Ljubljana, which is now the capital of Slovenia. It's way up at the northern tip of the Adriatic Sea. And the idea there was, if you can get our armies between, ideally if we could get them to the borders of the old Soviet Union wouldn't get any new territories. Stalin obviously opposed this, and FDR basically came down on Stalin's side, and that is it. I mean, two of the three, the main allies, and so we invaded France instead. Militarily, I can't speak to the efficacy of one or the other over the other, but in terms of politics, I can say that, this idea that World War II was to liberate people. And it is true that some people were liberated, although actually more French people were killed by Allied bombs than were killed by the Germans. It seems that most French people seem to be okay with that. Of course, we don't have the votes of the people who died in the aerial bombings, but 10 countries in Eastern Europe were occupied by a regime that was as bad or worse than the Nazis. As bad or worse. And that systematically went around killing anyone that they thought would oppose them in a more thorough way than the Nazis ever did. And this is real obvious in Poland. The whole war started because Poland was invaded by Germany and the USSR, actually. And famous story, at some point early in the 1940s, General Sikorsky, who was one of the main Poles to escape to England, started going to the British government and saying, hey, I want to promise that when the war is over, Poland is not a puppet state of the USSR. And they basically were like, we're in war mode right now, we're not going to talk about it. And he said, I'm looking at a map here, and it looks like the reason that we went to war is going to be mixed. That our arch enemy, the USSR, is going to take over Poland. And he threatened to tell the press that the Katainen Forest massacre, the massacre of the German officers, one small group of them, that the Germans had discovered was actually perpetrated by the Soviets. and then he died in a plane accident after that. Never got to tell anybody. So there's that, and then there is this little episode. Nikolai Tolstoy, the great nephew of the illustrious Tsarist author. This book is a must-read of World War II history. I hear it referenced every once in a while, and it is about how before the war ended, Stalin went to the Allies and said, listen, I want every person you capture who is Russian sent back to the Soviet Union, whether they want to come or not. And this includes people who aren't even in the war, expats, people who have been living in the West since the revolution. I want them all, every single one of them, back in the USSR. During the war, the Germans captured millions of Soviets. This was a big embarrassment because the Americans and the British, they had tens of thousands captured. The Soviets, they'd have 500,000 surrender at once on one or two occasions. I think in total it was like 4 or 5 million. And the Germans deported a whole bunch of people too once they occupied territories. Stalin feared these people because they had been to the West, and they were, almost all of them were sent to the gulags, and many of them died. And the Allies, this is an account of the Allies giving them back to the Soviets, and many of them were summarily executed, sometimes in front of the British and American soldiers who turned them over, which, by the way, is a crime. If you have someone and you turn them over and you know they're going to be killed, which there's documentation that they did know that, at least some of them, that is actually a war crime in and of itself. And it's interesting because the number that was turned over to the Soviets is about 2 million, and a large percentage of those were executed, and a much larger percentage of them died in the Gulag system, and every once in a while some of them would survive. I actually read about that in Solzhenitsyn, but this book really covers it. And this is like a Holocaust. This is, by the numbers, it's the third Holocaust, about a third of the size of the Holocaust, which is just a Holocaust, one of many. And this one perpetrated by the Allies. Now, I will say the Americans were better about it than the British. The British just follow orders, and they sent people without questioning. The Americans, a lot of them, when they figured out what was happening, they would just let the prisoners go. They would say, well, we got to go to the Soviet camp now, open up the gate, and they'd all escape into Switzerland or whatever. But this is a shameful episode in history, unprecedented in scale, and the vast majority of people have never ever heard of it. So I would recommend getting this book. I don't think it's that expensive. You can probably find it on Amazon. Secret Betrayal, Nikolai Tolstoy. So there's that, and then, gosh, do I really need to talk about the atom bombs? I think I do. I need to do a video on the surrender of Japan. Let's just say that the main thing in the West and with Germany is the unconditional surrender and the fact that the Soviet Union was helped so much. Never should have happened, and yet it did. So this isn't to say the generals were bad, although I tend to think the American generals weren't nearly as good as the German ones. The only one I really like is Patton, and I don't know that much about him, so I'm not sure if he really even deserves that, but whatever. Alright, on to Japan.